My name is Anthony Paul Filiberto, and I've been an artist the vast majority of my life. Particularly, I've been a full-time artist here in Provincetown for the last 15 years. I was very fortunate to grow up in a home where we had a lot of art, and my dad was just an absolute wonderful artist. He was great with color. He could illustrate just about anything. For a living, he was a cabinet maker, so he would walk into someone's home, and at the time he would cart us, the kids, around with him, and he'd sit down at the kitchen table and design a kitchen for people and then go off and build it. But it was from his drawings that he would be able to sell his product. And after that, we would go home and cartoon, at the kitchen table, and we were introduced to it very young. So I paint a lot of different things, and some of it is mood. Some of it might be I jokingly say to people all the time, it's the medication, because they find humor in the fact that my work is so diverse in terms of subject. But essentially, it's life experience. I started to buy paint in these caulk tubes that everybody talks about my painting with caulk guns, and it is true. I paint with a caulk gun and a big spatula. But the thing that happened is I was off on my way to my studio in an old beat-up Jeep, had no doors, and my neighbor who lived on the corner had planted these 7-foot sunflowers that were growing into the morning sun and subsequently blocking the view of all oncoming traffic at the intersection. So as I was gradually pulling out in my Jeep to get a look at oncoming traffic and peek around these sunflowers, I basically was almost hit by a tour bus. And needless to say, the adrenaline was rushing, and the bus was just a short distance from my Jeep. And I drove off to the studio, and I got to the studio, and I looked over into the corner, and I saw this 6-foot canvas. And I had just started to purchase yellow paint in these 10-ounce tubes, and the only way you could dispense it was in a caulk gun. So with all this adrenaline flowing, I picked up the caulk gun and I started just, painting what I had in my mind from this near accident. And at the end of the day, I had a studio visit from Carrie, and she came in and she saw the painting. I figured I just wasted $500 of paint. Carrie saw it as something really magnificent, insisted on having it even though it was dripping wet, carted it off to the gallery, and maybe 3 or 4 hours later, a gentleman walked in, and he decided to purchase the painting and also commission 2 additional paintings with the same kind of genre and feel to them. So I suddenly found myself going from painting with a small brush to painting with a caulk gun, and that was really the beginning of these real textured florals. I've actually elected to sculpt the paint and turn it into a 3-dimensional object. The light to find its own highlight in the texture, and also have the texture of the floral cast its own shadow. And in effect, what happens is the floral becomes 3-dimensional. And in low light, it actually behaves more like a sculpture than it does a painting. You realize when you're working in Provincetown as an artist that you're in a community that generally has 80 really well-developed galleries, maybe couple of thousand really good artists, in the region. And if you want to make an attempt at making a living at painting and not end up doing carpentry work, one of the things that you really need to bring to your work was voice. And for me, that probably has come out or been projected through technique. And when I started to tackle urbanscapes, I resorted back to an old method that we learned. Classic painting the Rembrandt method was introduced to us, and basically what that was is you worked your painting out completely in black and white before you added color. And that was to make sure that you weren't concealing any defects in the painting with the use of color, that the painting had to be balanced, it had to be good in composition, it had to tell a story without the introduction of color. And I always liked my black and white paintings. And obediently, when the instructor would come around and say, okay, you can add color, I would just go off and add color. and I would, initially abandon the original black and white painting. And one day I was working out a painting here of an urban scene, and people kept coming in and commenting on how much they liked it, and basically at the time it had no color. So I started doing my urbanscapes in black and white. I do have a lot of variation in my technique. In my black and whites, what I've elected to do is I've actually elected to do the entire painting with these rollers. And you can see by looking at some of the detail in the painting is that it just gives a real loose feel to some of the structure that feels like you look at it when you're looking up into the light. And then after several layers of paint are applied, I actually begin with a smaller roller to make an attempt at drawing, certain lines that are critical to giving the painting some perspective. And, and once that's completed, what I do is I just introduce some highlight, again, to really give the painting some feeling. These are rainy nights. The series are, typically in the evening. The rainy nights, you see individuals, the suggestion of people walking about the city with umbrellas. And then this feeling that I think you can only get from these rollers of what the street might look like, on a rainy night with all the reflected light. One of the things that I really have a lot of fun painting are seascapes. And this is a part of a series called Low Tide. I particularly enjoy doing the skies. If this were a different painting, and let's say the water horizon line were down at this level, the painting would be about the sky. This particular painting is about the water, and it's about the rhythm of the water. So what I'm trying to convey through the application of the paint is I want you to feel the rhythm of what is occurring at low tide. The whole canvas is painted like the sky is painted, so that there is consistency through the painting of this color. And if you were to look careful at certain spots of the painting, not only would you find this in repetition, but you would also find certain strokes were not horizontal as the painting appears, but they're vertical. So two things are occurring. One is there's a uniformity to the painting based on this being the primary consistent color over the whole canvas. Secondly, there's a feeling of dimensionality that comes from painting the whole painting against the form. So rather than it being painted horizontally, it's initially painted, vertically. And some of these are very evident, in the painting. Once the whole canvas is covered with a color, the sky, and it's all going to look pretty similar to the way the sky looks, I'm basically taking caulk guns and I'm putting the different colors in where I think they primarily lie, with a gun, just by putting a bead, almost like you would a bead of caulk. And then in some instances, I'm using, a plaster tool, and I'm pulling these beads of color down so that they neighbor one another, from the top to bottom. And then once I've got that effect, I'm using a tool that looks a little bit like this, and I'm pulling the colors into one another. And what I'm doing is I'm creating colors from colors that neighbor one another. And so there's a whole array of colors that get created, on the surface of the canvas as opposed to the surface of the palette. And then kind of as a final touch, to get the rhythm of the painting, I do a couple of things. I usually have some good music on, which is very, very important. But then I just kind of pull this really lighter accent color across to, fill in the composition, to give it that feeling of, of dimensionality, and then also highlight. And that process occurs over, several sessions over maybe a 2 or 3 week period of working on the same painting. So the painting is not done, in a single session. It's really done over time because each of these layers of color have to be dry before I can pull another color over them. But also while I'm working certain sections, particularly when I'm pulling colors into one another, it all has to be wet. So a lot of this, again, is about execution of the method. I'm a rhythm painter. Every artist brings something different. The Impressionists, they like to paint light, so their whole painting is about whether the conveyance of light. The realists, they like to paint that the image is almost photo-like, and their measure of a good painting is whether or not it looks just like the image that they were looking at. I'm an expressionist, so even though my work is representational, my focus is on rhythm. I want you to feel the energy that I'm feeling when I'm painting the painting, and and I hope that comes through when you look at basically the energy in my work.